I'm just procrastinating again. I want to talk about the long-term prognosis of dieback infested sites in Banksia Woodlands. And I need to explain right at the beginning that although I've worked with Phytophthora cinnamomi and other soil-borne pathogens in a number of ecosystems over a few years, I've never really worked much with Banksias, and I certainly haven't worked in Banksia Woodlands. So I'd like you to take this as informed comment. Now, the present situation, there's a lot of information out there about how to protect native ecosystems, about what dieback is, about how to recognise symptoms, and it's all focused basically on minimising the risk of infestation and minimising spread through quarantine and hygiene methods. And of course, this is very sensible biosecurity information. If sites do become infested, then there's a possibility of using phosphonate or phosphite treatments for woody plants, but this isn't curative. And so if you're dealing with long-term vegetation, it's ongoing. It just slows down the infections. And of course, there are questions about using phosphonate, which will eventually result in phosphorus enrichment of sites on these highly leached phosphorus-deficient soils and the very diverse vegetation there, which really depends on these highly leached soils for its unique characters. But what about the sites that have been infested for a long time? What do we do about them? Do we lock them up and throw away the key? And so I'd like to take that really as the basis for my talk to perhaps start a discussion. So I'm going to start in Victoria with some work done by this lady, Weste, who was one of the pioneers of Phytophthora work in Australia. She was at the University of Melbourne, and in 1970 she set up some comparisons of infested and uninfested quadrats. They were on 13 sites. They were in forest, woodland and heathlands, and they were in 3 areas, in the Brisbane Ranges, in the Grampians and at Wilson's Promontory. In addition to looking at the various floristic values, which ecologists would do, she also looked at the detection rate of Phytophthora cinnamomi in soils and in roots by baiting out soil samples and by baiting out roots from dying plants. Between 1970 and 1984, she found that the detection rate in soil was about 100%, and it was 100% from root samples from these infested sites. There was a decrease in the understory species. Between 50 and 75% died, including the very susceptible species like Xanthorrhoea australis and isopogons. The species richness was reduced, the percentage cover was reduced, the community structure changed, there was much more bare ground, more rushes and sedges, and leptospermum invaded. Well, I don't think any of you would be very surprised by any of this. But continuing monitoring these plots between 1985 and 2000, and I really just want to talk about the results from 2000, things changed. Firstly, it was a lot drier. The detection rate of Phytophthora cinnamomi from soil by 2000 was very much lower. On 4 of the 13 sites, it wasn't detected. In 6 of those 13 sites, it was there at a much lower level. And it was only isolated at a high rate from the wettest sites. And it was only isolated from 1% of the roots that they baited out. A secondary succession occurred, with 30 to 40% of susceptible species, including what they considered susceptible indicator species like Xanthorrhoea australis, they came back to the sites. They regenerated on the sites. And they didn't just germinate and then die, they actually recolonized these sites. So she regarded this as a secondary succession. And thinking about these as a plant pathologist, I would ask the question, are these regenerating plants disease escapes? Are they tolerant hosts or are they resistant hosts? And I'd like to explain those terms. If you think about a soil-borne pathogen like Phytophthora, which is widespread but very infrequent, you can visualize a situation where seedlings of susceptible plants will germinate on that site, but they may never actually come into contact with the pathogen, and so their disease escapes. What about tolerant hosts? Well, these are plants which are infected, and they may be quite badly infected, but they show no symptoms. And what about resistant hosts? Well, these are plants which either can't be infected or are infected, but the infection is contained very rapidly by the host. Now, if you consider a particular plant species, there are going to be some plants which are susceptible, and those are going to be the majority, but there are going to be outliers. Some of these are going to be a little bit more tolerant, some of these are going to be resistant, but they're going to be very infrequent in the whole population. And so if you have a lot of plants which are considered susceptible re-invading infested sites, it's far more likely that those are disease escapes. So what about Western Australia? Is there similar data available? And the short answer, of course, is no, at least not as far as I'm aware. Most of the work that's been done here is by Brian Shearer from Deepore, or was it Calm, or whatever its name is next week. And he used a space for time substitution model to study the vegetation changes, but there was no detailed sampling for Phytophthora cinnamomi in the way that it was done in Victoria. He looked at 46 disease centres on the Swan Coastal Plain. These were south of Perth, and they were went down to just north of Margaret River. And he estimated from aerial photography that they'd been infested for between 15 and 40 years. He divided these 46 sites into 4 impact classes. There were the low impact sites, where very few deaths had occurred. Those sites of intermediate impact had the odd scattered deaths, but they were certainly less than 30%. There were high impact, intermediate to high impact sites, where between 30 to 90% were occurring and they were on the front, and high impact sites where the most susceptible tree and understory was dead. But because there was only a single set of observations, you can't say whether or not this represents a progression. They found that the decrease in numbers of species, abundance and ground cover, there was a decrease in canopy closure and in basal area. And in some of the sites, Banksias actually persisted. There was also an increase in some of the herbs, particularly the Restianaceae and the Hemideraceae. But there were also a few anomalies. And I think anomalies are really important because they make you go back and think again about your assumptions. 2 of the anomalies, the little fern Lindsea linearis died out, but it's a resistant plant. You can't even infect it. And then there's Daisy Pogan, which Shearer regarded as a susceptible species, but in some areas it actually increases. Why does this happen? Now, one of the things that Shearer didn't do was do the detailed sampling of the sites to get some estimate of the amount of Phytophthora that's there. And there is some other information which may be relevant here, and it's work done by Francis Tay and myself a long time ago, which again uses a space for time substitution model. And this was used to determine the detection rate of Phytophthora from the centre and margin of dieback sites. It was a big study. We looked at 10 sites and took 100 samples from each. Most of the sites were in the forest, but there were 2 from the Swan Coastal Plain. And the Swan Coastal Plain sites didn't really seem to be very different. What we found was that we could recover Phytophthora cinnamomi from 1.1% of all the samples taken from the centre of old dieback sites. And we found that we could recover Phytophthora cinnamomi from 2.2% of samples at the margin of dieback sites. So Phytophthora is perhaps infrequent, and we can also say that across transect across a dieback site, it appears that Phytophthora cinnamomi decreases over time. Let's put those two things together and see what we come up to. 2 plus 2 makes 5. So we can say that the detection rate of Phytophthora cinnamomi is low in old dieback sites. And of course we can check this by repeating the sort of sampling that I did. We can ask questions about the surviving plants. Are the surviving susceptible plants, such as daisy pogon, disease escapes, tolerant hosts, or resistant hosts? And that can be checked too. When you think about a dieback site, it's rather different from the nearby uninfested vegetation. There's a decrease in canopy closure, and this will modify the site characteristics. The sites will be wetter because there's less interception of rainfall. So they're wetter in winter, if you're lucky, and they're going to be hotter and drier in summer. So do vegetation changes result solely from infection? And is a modified site more suitable for some susceptible species, such as daisy pogon, and less suitable for others, such as Lindsia? And all these things can be checked. What about regeneration? This was seen in Victoria. It means there must be a seed source either within that site or nearby, so there's wind-blown seed. So is there an adequate seed bank on these old dieback sites? Or is it the seed bank of species that are no longer able to survive in a more exposed site? And again, these things can be checked. So what about a prognosis? Can we say anything? Firstly, is there any other data available? Really, what I've dealt with is a very small data set for a very large area. Is there data in people's filing cabinets? Repeated observations of the same sites that say whether or not there is regeneration on these old dieback sites? There's a lot of checking that I think is needed. Firstly, what's the detection rate of Phytophthora in these old dieback sites? Is it as low as I have suggested? Are the surviving plants of susceptible species disease escapes? It can be checked fairly easily. How do the site conditions change? How have they changed? This too can be checked. What are the site requirements for the species that used to occur there? Do we know this? Can the ecologists tell us? I'm sure they can. And what about the seed bank? I'm sure that too can be checked. Now, the present situation is perhaps politically useful, appropriate, for looking at some of these things again. With the federal recognition of Banksia woodlands as a threatened ecological community, and the recognition of Phytophthora cinnamomi many years ago as a threatening process. Perhaps it's an opportunity to go back and look at these dieback sites again, and maybe do some of the checking that I have suggested is needed. There's also a lot of experience now about the restoration of Banksia woodlands, and could this be applied to the rehabilitation of old dieback sites? We've heard so much about restoration this morning, and there's also a great deal of experience from people in Kings Park. And I would suggest that dieback has had a terrible reputation. There's a lot of emotion around it, but I'd like to think that we can look forward with a great deal more optimism by trying to be quite meticulous about what we're talking about the changed conditions, about the detection rate of Phytophthora. And so we can look forwards perhaps with optimism at trying to rehabilitate some of these sites. I think it's worth trying, rather than backwards with pessimism. Thank you very much.